a radio show every Wednesday. He frequently appears on Bloomberg's TV show Think Tank. His op-eds, hear this, have been published by Huffington Post, Religion News Service, Town Hall, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So he's a model for us, and also he's going to enlighten us on so all your questions about the people in your classrooms, the young people and all this, save them up for Nick.
I just apologize on behalf of millennials and older. No,
well, we apologize on the weekend.
I don't know.
All those other
I am going to go ahead and say that I don't know if you all have seen the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Has anyone seen this new Quentin Tarantino?
Do we need to see it?
I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I had no clue how crazy the 60s was. And so I have a greater appreciation, but also a gripe with y'all talking about millennials and Gen Z after seeing that. And then I went on this huge tangent of reading as much as I can on Charles Manson. My goodness, what a guy. Wow, thank you for him. But in all seriousness, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today to share a little bit about the students that are in your classroom. I'm not a student that's in your classroom. I'm the older generation, the millennial. So but I am an Uber riding, still student debt collecting, selfie taking, Snapchatting, Facebooking millennial. And so grateful to be here with you all, and I've always been captivated by kind of some of these age differences and the characteristics of kind of the individuals that are in the classroom today. And so what I hope to be able to do is hopefully illuminate through 5 characteristics some of the characteristics that are present within the students that are in your classroom today, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about some of those individuals as well as what some of the research is telling us, and then in turn from a Christian perspective, understanding glory, meaning the weightiness. How do we understand what is the weightiness that we bring in interacting with the younger generation as well? But I do have to tell you that not only did I go see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and was scared to death of the 1960s, but I also spent some time in Spain recently. I've been captivated by the idea of risk. So a natural outgrowth of that was going to run with the bulls in Spain last month. So let me give the research first, and then I'll move into the story. And so there was a research project that was put out by an individual at Syracuse University. He decided that as a good economist, he was going to send out a call to individuals that if you are an individual that feels paralyzed by a particular decision that you're facing right now, a significant decision, and you feel free and you don't care which way you go, either saying yes and taking the risk or saying no and sticking to the status quo, I want you to come back to me and I'm going to flip a coin. And that coin will be able to determine which way that you go. So a significant decision being something along the lines of a job move, an engagement, a move to a different house, etc. So a significant decision. Upwards of 26,000 Americans said that I'm facing a significant decision right now. I'm willing to allow this stranger that's an economist, that's in the towers of academia, flip a coin in order to determine whether I go yes or whether I go no. Yes, I take the risk. No, I stick to the status quo. And one of the fascinating things that happened is that regardless of outcome, whether it was positive or negative, staying still or taking the risk, what the researcher found is that individuals who took the risk, regardless of outcome, had higher levels of happiness. That we're living in a world today that what he contends is more averse to risk today. When he segmented it out, not only there's more averseness to risk, but also individuals that were willing to take the risk and experience greater levels of happiness. As Christians, we know this to be true, right? We don't necessarily call it risk. We say taking the step of faith. We say taking the leap of faith, if we're Kierkegaard, right? That the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field which a man finds and goes and hides again. and risks everything in order that he might be able to purchase the field. Right? The kingdom of heaven is like taking a risk, is what Jesus would say. So that's what brought me to Spain. I decided that my life had been a little too averse to risk, so I decided to take a risk in going to Spain. And so I decided that I was going to find some buddies that were just as stupid as I was, and we were going. I grew up in Tennessee, and so I'm used to cow tipping, not necessarily used to cow running away. And so I found some buddies that were also from Tennessee, and we decided that we were going to wake up early one morning and be in Pamplona, Spain, and to run. I don't know if you're familiar with the San Fermin Festival in Pamplona, but I will tell you, people in Pamplona, they know how to celebrate life. They make New Orleans look like a Chuck E. Cheese. My goodness. The day before the first run of the bulls, it is unbelievable how much they celebrate life. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the day before the run with the bulls, it's just this huge citywide festival where hundreds of thousands of people pile into this city. They situate tables right outside of stores, and individuals are just coming to and fro to be able to sit at this table and enjoy sangria, enjoy life. Starting at 9 a.m. is where I saw the first table. And then when I woke up the next morning at 5:30 to make my way to the bull route, there were still hundreds of individuals in the streets celebrating life and enjoying each other's company. It was it was unbelievable. That picture temporarily eased the anxiety and fear as I made my way toward the bull ring. But one of the things that I found, and so you're kind of standing there, and you can see everyone's doing their stretches, everyone's getting ready. Eventually the time comes at around 7:30 that they shut down the gates so that you can't get into the rink, or you can't get into the path, because it's about 3/10 of a mile long, and so you make your way in towards City Square, and then you're positioning yourself at about 7:30 with the bulls coming on one end. At the end of the course, there is the bull ring, the bull arena, where the bulls are running into 3/10 of a mile. About probably the widest stretch would be anywhere from probably about 10 yards at most. The skinniest stretch would probably be about 5 yards. That you're not running on a track, you're running on bricks more than likely in most spots. As you can imagine, when individuals are enjoying and celebrating life all throughout the night, the street gets a little bit slip, to say. Everyone's all wearing white in the morning. They're wearing pink by the end of the afternoon because they're cheersing each other. And I don't know if you've had sangria, but sangria kind of makes it a little bit slippery when you're running. And so there's an anxiety, there's fear that's welling up inside of me until eventually 8 o'clock comes, and at 8 o'clock they shoot off this rocket, this cannon at one end, and all of a sudden there are now bulls that are in this arena that are moving their way towards you at speeds that vary. And so I'm just kind of standing there waiting, because I know that if you get to the bull arena too quickly, the Spaniards will start throwing stuff at you and yelling stuff that probably isn't edifying. But thankfully I only know about 10 Spanish words, and so I wouldn't be able to translate. But I do know that I'm a man that has way too much pride that I need to crucify, and that I do not want to get into that bull arena too early. And so as I'm just kind of waiting there, all of a sudden I'm looking back, making sure, getting ready, feeling the pushes of everybody, because it's the first day, it's the only weekend that they're going to be there. There's tons of people, thousands of people that are running this. And then all of a sudden I see one person from a corner that's starting to run. That's enough for me. I know that I've got a whole vacation after this. There's no part of me that I want to be more holy. I don't want to have more holes in me. And so that's enough for me to start running. And I'm running as fast as I can at this moment. And in the midst of the running, not knowing where my friends are, not caring where my friends are, just wanting to make sure that I get safely into the arena and climb up onto a fence. in those moments, reflecting on it when I was making my way back to the States, I realized I was taking this huge risk, wanting to have this huge thrill in it, but I wasn't necessarily sure why I was doing it outside of just the desire to be happy. There was a lot of things that could go wrong, but the thrill and the happiness in that moment was sufficient for me to do this. And I would submit that that's very much like these generations that we find ourselves amongst of students. Of not necessarily thinking through everything, but the thrill of the moment, myopically consumed in this particular moment, is characteristic of today's students. And so, let's jump into the bull arena, shall we? And let's consider the characteristics of today's students.
I must break in here and say, I took my grandson last year. His view of things were absolutely in consonance with what you were saying. My view was, as a 77-year-old guy, these are all just a bunch of drunks. It's not a celebration, and the world is going to hell in a handbag. So that's the difference between a 77-year-old guy and a millennial. So that's it.
There we are. Well, let's consider some of the characteristics that I think are important for us crazies up here today. And so I think there's 5 characteristics, like I said. I think the first characteristic is the lack of trust. That we have to know the lack of trust when we're understanding today's student. It's as fresh as today's headlines. We're getting fed an overwhelming amount of news items that are indicating that we shouldn't have any trust in today's world today. I mean, we look at today's news and you see the Boy Scouts, quite literally. There's more information that's coming out relative to the Boy Scouts about having ineligible volunteer lists. Upwards of Boy Scouts from all 50 states there's Boy Scouts from all 50 states represented on this particular list that have been abused by these scout leaders. That when we look to the church, it's not just the Catholic Church, it's also the Protestant Church as well. The Southern Baptist denomination, my denomination being one of them, of having this secretness that's allowed some of these abuses to come from. We can look back to the mid-90s and early 2000s when the Enron scandal was kind of rocking the world. We think about WMDs and what's happening. All we've known in today's student is war and wondering why we're still over there. You see, there's plenty of reasons to generate and to give cause to this lack of trust, and the numbers also indicate that as well. A generation ago, 50% of Americans said that they could trust their neighbor. That number today, as best we can tell, is 33%. And then when you isolate it towards individuals that are from the ages of 18 to 24, that number drops to 19% today. 19% of individuals 18 to 24 would say that they can trust their neighbor. This lack of trust isn't just happening from an individual standpoint. This lack of trust is also happening from a civic standpoint as well. That individuals from a Christian perspective, we often give a lot of emphasis towards individuals that are just leaving the church. Well, the reality of the matter is they're not just leaving the church over a lack of trust, they're leaving every institution over lack of trust. You can look at the numbers of higher education, individuals that there's a lack of trust there. And from a police standpoint, from a civic engagement standpoint, people aren't joining the Boy Scouts anymore. The Boy Scouts are suffering such low membership rates that they've opened it up to girls now, right? The Girl Scouts are suffering under numbers. You've got the Civitans, you've got the Rotary clubs. Well, there's just a massive civic disengagement that's happening. But this isn't anything new, right? Like Robert Putnam out of Harvard has been writing on this for years, talking about the idea that we're bowling alone now. That individuals aren't joining bowling leagues anymore. And there's just this massive withdrawal from society that due to, I would argue, a lack of trust in the institutions of society. There's a rising skepticism that fails to capture the brilliance of what Marcus Talleyrand says, that without individuals, nothing changes, but without institutions, nothing survives. Millennials, Gen Z have that impetus, they have that onus inside of them that desires to be able to change the world. The Rainers have done a lot of research on this, of individuals that are 17 to 21, saying that 94% of them believe that they can change the world. But the reality is, as we know to be true, that yes, it's good and amen, you want to have that energy, that palpable energy to want to bring about change, but if you don't tie it to an institution or don't build it into an institution, that change doesn't have any it won't sustain itself. And so there's a lack of trust, but I would also argue that that lack of trust has caused a withdrawal, and that withdrawal has manifested itself into what we know as the loneliness epidemic that we're living in today. The students that are in your classrooms today, more often than not, probably do not have a best friend. More often than not, probably do not have someone they can talk to. There was an article as recent, I wanted to put it into this little daily email that I send out of the New York Post today, talking about how not millennials, but individuals begin 18 to 24 don't have a best friend. Upwards of 40% don't have someone that they can talk to. 40% of Americans, just Americans in general, say that they feel lonely. According to a Harvard Medical School study, that if you feel lonely, it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. There's a loneliness epidemic that's sweeping across the U.S. right now, and the numbers are bearing this out. There was a fascinating study that was put out by Barna that compared and contrasted 1985 to then moved it to 2004. And what they found is that in 1985, 10% of Americans said that if something significant happened to them, they didn't have anyone to turn to. 10%. Something significant happened to them, we got nobody's out there to help me. Well, when they did that measure again in 2004, that number jumped up to 25% of Americans. It's just this loneliness that is so pervasive in our society today. It's beginning to manifest itself, as we're seeing, in a variety of different ways. And I would argue one of those ways that loneliness, that contributing to that loneliness, is those feelings of connection that we have through Facebooks and social medias to kind of give us the glimpse that we're kind of tapping into that loneliness, but not really satisfying it as well. There was a study that found, again, the Barna study found that in 1984 and 1985, the average American had 3.7 friends. That number in 2004 dropped down to 1.7. But what we know today within the American experiment is that the average American has 338 Facebook friends. So we can take part in that, which kind of leads us into the next point. So if we have the lack of trust that individuals have today, the second point being the loneliness that individuals are experiencing today. I think the third point that we have to talk about is the significance of technology that is just increasingly prevalent in today's world. I'm captivated by studies that are coming out. There's two studies in particular at that point that have just captivated my imagination when it comes to the significance of technology. That even the mere presence of a phone on a table has the propensity to hinder connectivity between individuals. It's gotten to such an extent, I think I shared this last time I was with you all, it's gotten to such an extent now that my roommates and I like to have just a meal once a week together. But we also know how prone we are to look at our phones during that meal. That keeps us from connecting with one another. And so what we've decided to do now is everybody piles their phone into the middle of the table. And whoever picks up their phone during the meal has to pick up the bill. We're committed to connecting with one another.
That's a great idea.
So like,
and if nobody picks up the phone, then what about the meal?
Yeah, and then we've hedged our bets, and I've gone all in with my meal, and now I got to pay for it. But it's not just the mere connectivity as well, but there's also just the idea that we can't cognitively think as well either. There's a study out of Drexel University that found the mere presence of a phone on a desk hinders cognitive skills. Like if I'm constantly thinking about the phone, I'm thinking about the phone, I can't really concentrate. And there's some other research we'll get to as well. But here's some other numbers that I thought would be interesting, and we'll do kind of interactive survey here. Are you an individual that walks and uses your phone? Are you an individual that walks and uses your phone?
Uses it to talk or uses it to?
Text, talk, while you're walking, do you use your phone?
Podcasting.
You're on podcasting, yeah. You are affectionately known as a dead walker. So if you are an individual that walks and uses your phone, you're a dead walker. And the state has started to do things about this. The number of pedestrian deaths has risen to 6,000 in the past year, with many of them attributable to the idea that individuals are largely not paying attention anymore. I've had bruises, like I've had cuts because I've hit a tree because I just was completely unaware. And you have there's Oregon as well as Nevada have passed bills that say that you cannot be crossing a crosswalk and be on your phone. Now, because 6,000 deaths largely, and we're starting to see a significant contingent of those are individuals that are on their phone. Are you an individual that sleeps with your phone by your bed? Hands? Yeah. You join 80% of Americans that are sleeping with their phone by their bed. But we also know the blue light that is emitted from looking at your phone at night hinders your sleep as well. The depth of your sleep is hindering that. I found this to be kind of silly, but I thought I'd throw it out there. The average American is sending and receiving 92 text messages a day. Is that low? If it's low for you, raise your hand.
How would the people have time for that?
Yeah. So there's a thing called group message that many of your students are in. And so while I've been up here right now, I'm a part of probably 4 or 5 group messages. I have got 36 messages that are and I zeroed out right before I came up here, which points to, and this is probably a tangential, but I think it'll illuminate the reason why there's so many text messages. I would argue that today's students see things relationally more than anything. They've grown up in a world in which divorce was at an all-time high. Well, now, granted, we can say that divorce rates have lowered, but cohabitation rates have skyrocketed as well. But you're seeing a world in which individuals know about relational brokenness, and so they go to great lengths to be able to maintain those relationships to great degrees. They're leaving the home, they're going further than they have been. I'm the only one within my family that's decided to leave the great state of Tennessee to come here to Texas. Hopefully not going to suffer the same fate as Davy Crockett. But you better believe, like, I'm still keeping up with my Tennessee friends. That's a group message that's affectionately referred to as the Guy Fieri fan club, because we have a strange affinity for Guy Fieri, the celebrity show. Listen.
So how does that fit, this desire to, or go to great lengths to maintain relationships with the loneliness that's endemic?
Yeah, so it's funny because I actually went to a long excursion on this the other day with a friend, and so it's to the extent that we feel connected with them, but we've lost actually connection to them. So there's the feeling of connection, like, so for example, seeing it on Facebook, seeing it on the social media sites. It's really a one-way conversation that you're beginning to have with individuals, which incurs levels of guilt too when you don't have the chance to be able to respond appropriately.
So you're talking about going to great lengths using technology to connect with people, but not actually having
the connection.
Friendships.
Yeah, the actually impersonal one-on-one time. 51% of Americans don't even know their neighbor's name.
And that goes back to your earlier point. When somebody tells me, a student tells me, I've got 338 friends on Facebook, I say, really? How many of them could you borrow 20 bucks from?
Yeah. Which was a fascinating conversation I had with some friends the other day, because we were coming up on a 10-year high school reunion, and many of them said, why would I go to a 10-year high school reunion? I'm keeping up with these individuals and the people that I've seen online that say they're going. I don't want to hear anything from them. Isn't that so fascinating?
So curious, and moving over to Texas, Nick, does that mean you still paint your face orange? And,
Well, I'm a Vanderbilt man through and through, so I would never do. So I was born in the belly of the beast, Knoxville, Tennessee. So
does your loyalty? So what I was asking actually related to millennials was, what about loyalty?
yeah.
So is there a lesser loyalty to different points of affinity and association? Say, I mean, if you just switch from one UT to another UT.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And so I would probably I'd have to segment my answers out. And so, for example, I was talking to a group of CFOs the other day, and they were wrestling with the idea of how much do we need to invest in the workplace atmosphere. And I say for millennials specifically, for today's work, and this is millennials, and millennials are very different. Well, they're not very different, but there's deviations of difference relative to Gen Z. But with millennials, if you're going to say to them that you're going to create a work atmosphere and make them come to work, you're going to have to put your money where your mouth is and create a work atmosphere that's very conducive for community as well. Because the most significant thing that you're seeing among millennials right now is there is an uptick in the number of hours that they're working because there's a bleed over relative to technology that's allowing you to bring your work home right now. But there's also a high level of individuals that don't think that their company is going to be loyal to them, so they're always looking to make sure that their resume is up to date so they can jump around.
So it's always about reciprocity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very transactional world, and I think a part of that is the skepticism and the cynicism. Yeah, there's a disloyalty there, but they're also disloyal as well. I mean, there was a recent article. There was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about ghosting. Are you all familiar with ghosting? No. Ghosting is where that you just kind of go silent on an individual that sent you an email or sent you a text message and you don't respond to it. Well, the Wall Street Journal article interviewed various CEOs, and they found that individuals now, because the economy is so white hot, they are ghosting their jobs now. They're not even giving 2 weeks advance notice when they're leaving because they've already found another job, and so they're just not showing up anymore.
I saw an article on that, yeah.
It's fascinating. The disloyalty and the cynicism that my company's not looking out for me, that I've got to be out. I've got to be the one to watch out for myself is so.
So that whole statement, "Ask not what your country."
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. So I wrote an article for a little magazine about that, and so there was a previous generation that asked, "What's my duty to my country?" And now our current generation finds itself saying, "What are my rights?" And the differentiation between the duty and the rights. Individuals that aren't. I've already sacrificed because I was born at this time in which I'm now taking a pay cut because of the economic recession of 2008. Now it's my time to be able to fight for what I deserve. Individuals, there's just a largely an aversion to sacrifice for the betterment of the whole. Yes, sir.
Related to that loyalty point, I don't remember the study precisely, but millennials don't give over a period of time to institutions. They give one time to a cause they find emotionally compelling. So it's the same. It's part of the pattern.
It's fascinating. So there's an individual called book called The Great Evangelical Recession by Dickinson that points to how the churches are in for something right now, and you're seeing a massive transfusion of wealth that's transitioning over from the boomer generation to a millennial generation. But the millennial generation hasn't left the church because they never went to church in the beginning. And so what does it look like when churches now are finding themselves in positions where they don't do? And again, this is assuming that every boomer, when the levels of millennials isn't comparable to the levels of boomers, what are they doing? And Dunham and Company and Indiana University, the Lilly School, has some great research on millennial giving patterns right now, and or lack thereof, probably is the better descriptor. Is it?
I wanted to ask you if you've heard something about what I'm going to share. There's a psychiatrist, Lisa Stroman in Phoenix, that counsels kids to try to get off of their smartphone, the Facebook things, because they let things go to the extent of where their self-image is so buried and how many likes they have on a phone. This one counselor has had about 5 teenagers commit suicide
Oh, man.
because of the fact that their sense of who they belong to is just kind of shattered.
So 2004 was the first year, and it hasn't switched since. 2004 was the first year that individuals under the age of 18, among individuals under the age of 18, there was more suicides than there were homicides. And it hasn't changed since. I think it's around, I think it's either 126 or 128 suicides happen every day. We're seeing, you can see the prevalence of it within the culture, various shows, 13 Reasons Why, Dear Evan Hansen, it's increasingly prevalent. And C.S. Lewis was, this might be a bit harsh, and I apologize if it is. There's part of it that just thinks that this is a generation that is men without chests. They haven't inculcated values to be able to understand the rigors of life. And I wouldn't put all the blame on parents, but I would say that we've moved away from a helicopter parent, because a helicopter parent is hovering over the child and ready to pick them up should something happen. I think we've transitioned now from moving away from a helicopter parent paradigm to now moving to a snowplow parent paradigm, where the parent is no longer hovering above, but they're in front of, to keep the child from even tripping in the first place. And when they keep the child from even tripping in the first place, The Vanishing American Adult by Senator Ben Sass has done some great work on this. And what he's found is that one of the lines that stuck out to me is he says, scar tissue inculcates character. And when you don't have that scar tissue, it can be very adverse. It can be very detrimental. Yes, sir.
So I wonder if you've done any comparative work on trust. And so what I have in mind is Canada and the UK. My wife was Canadian. We've lived in the United Kingdom. We lived in the United Kingdom about 20 years ago. But if tomorrow we lost everything, but we could afford a plane ticket, there are people in the UK that we could actually live with for a while till we got on our feet. The same thing is true with respect to Canada. I have my doubts with respect to most of the people I know in the United States. So it's, I don't know if things have changed, because obviously I'm not a millennial, but it just strikes me that there's a greater degree of trust, this is an anecdote, in Canada and the United Kingdom versus the United States. So I just wonder if you've done any work.
I can't speak to Canada, but I do know the UK about 2 years ago appointed a minister of loneliness. And so
Yes.
I know that I know that's prevalent over there. But I can think about it, so I ran this thought experiment just on myself. And I challenge you all, just think about this. If you lost your jobs immediately, how many levels would it take? How thick is your social fabric that would keep you from actually going out on the street and living on the street? So, for example, if I lost my job today, I know that one, there's other secondary sources of income, but if I lost those jobs too, then I still have savings, and I'd eventually run out of savings. And then I've got friends here that I know would put up with me. Past Benjamin Franklin's line that visitors are like fish, after 3 days they start to stink. So I could stay with them. And I've been blessed with quite a group of people here in Texas. Eventually I probably have to move back to Tennessee after a time. I've got friends in Tennessee that I think would put up with me because I've got leverage on them. But then I'd have to move to my parents. And my goodness, my parents would, my mom would put up with me years. She's a long-suffering soul. I think about all of those levels that it takes for me. But then you think about it from other standpoints as well. So I think the reality, the friends, I realize I'm an outlier because I've been blessed with a significant amount of friends and church family members, etc. I've got a thick social fabric here. I think about it from a family standpoint, right? The reality is that 41% of kids that are born today are born into broken families. 41%.
That's the number, isn't it? Isn't that the taproot of all these problems?
I completely agree. Daniel Patrick Moynihan threw his hands up in the air in the 1970s when he released his book that indicated double digits when it got broke 11%, and now we're at 41. And you just think about how tattered our social fabric is today.
My two kids are way beyond millennials, so I'm not very familiar with that group at all. I've read that they aren't reading many books, etc. Jordan Peterson wrote 10, 12 rules for life, and it sold 3 million copies, but are any millennials familiar with that?
Oh, yeah, he is I consider Jordan Peterson the secular priest of a younger generation, and TED Talks are secular sermons. I think there's a desperation and yearning is my fifth point that I had. Victim and outrage culture is the fourth point. Let's jump on into yearning. There's a yearning that recognizes that I can't live in a relativistic world, because in a relativistic world, the strong man wins. And I know that there's always a stronger man. I'm fascinated. Gene Twenge out of San Diego State University has fascinating numbers when it looks at individuals that are Gen Z as well as millennials as well. And there's some comparisons about there's a downward trend of individuals relative to the spiritual disciplines. This younger generation is giving more money, giving less money than they ever have, praying less, showing a desire to read their Bible less, reading their Bible less, not going to church as much. There's only one. There's one that sticks out in her research about with the increase, and that one that sticks out is the belief that they're going to heaven. And so, again, we know it to be true that good works don't get us to heaven. We believe that good works are the byproduct of the love that is unconditional toward us. But it's fascinating that you would want to spend your entire earthly life running away from God, but then want to spend eternity with God. And I think that's indicative of a soul that's yearning for something. Right? We have more access to information than we ever have in the entirety of the world, yet it's still not sufficient. William Wordsworth put it like this: there's the intimations of immortality that are within us, right? Augustine says that our heart is restless until it finds its rest, and then Pascal says there's a God-shaped void inside of every individual. The preacher from Ecclesiastes says in Ecclesiastes 3:11, eternity has been placed within us. There's something that this immediate, instant gratification, Netflix world isn't satisfying those longings. But we've surrounded ourselves with enough information that we've kind of come to our own conclusions. And so this is where I'm fascinated, where there just requires a different type of response than we've given in previous generations. Previous generations said it had to be trained up in apologetics, and apologetics was giving an answer. And not necessarily, the response was in the form of an answer. But I would submit that when individuals already think that they have an answer, it requires us to do something more, rather ask questions. We've got to create cognitive dissonance through asking questions to be able to help individuals understand that they don't have the right answers. We have to help them to be able to be vessels of God that, like Jacob, wrestle with him and walk away with a limp, but blessed, knowing that we've encountered the living God. It's less trying to force more answers into people that already think they have answers, but ask questions to make them realize they don't have the right answers. To tap into that yearning that perhaps, maybe, the things of this world, the conclusions that I've reached, not only are they not sufficient, but they leave me wanting something more. And then we'll go back to the fourth. And so fourth point would be individuals. Okay, so you've got the lack of trust, you've got the loneliness, you've got the significance of technology, you've got the yearning for something more, and then the fourth would be reality that we're living in this outrage culture today. Really, it's kind of the byproduct of loneliness and distrust that we're living in. Two individuals out of the University of Iowa said that we used to live in a dignity culture, then we transitioned to an honor culture, and now we're moving into an outrage culture. And it's all about relative the power, how the power levers of our culture today. So in a dignity culture, you appeal to yourself to be able to exercise power. Right? That's why Washington, you read any books on Washington, what you'll find is that he took great pride in the way that he rode his horse, in the cut of his one or two uniforms that he wore, because he recognized that power was in the person. Right? And we know that to be true. We know that to be true from an incarnational, evangelical, biblical sense. Right? There's great power in a person, in your person. Transition from a dignity culture to an honor culture. In an honor culture, it's not so much your person that allows you to be able to exercise levers of power, but it's more appealing to the systems and structures that have been put into place. So that an individual like Abraham Lincoln can go ahead and say, we believe these truths to be self-evident, right? Pointing back to the systems and structures that are in place from previous generations to be able to leverage power to such an extent to be able to cash in on the promissory notes of the previous generation. And then transition forward to the third point, and now we transition away from a dignity culture, away from an honor culture, to now an outrage culture. How the people and the systems and structures that have been put into place harmed me in order that I might express my outrage to be able to get what I want. It's to the point that speech is now considered violence. Right? That we have these trigger warnings that are happening today, microaggressions that we're all keenly aware of. When I was listening, and this circles it back, when I was listening to the Charles Manson stuff, there's one podcast I was listening to, realizing how crazy y'all are. When they got to the point where they were talking about that infamous night where the Manson family killed Channing Tate, they said, and triggered. Now, that's so interesting. Like I pushed this. I knew exactly what I was getting, but you felt the need still to trigger me to know that the emotional disequilibrium that I was about to encounter, recognizing the evils of this world that were perpetuated. Just a fascinating time. That we're living in an outrage culture where individuals largely want to express their outrage. But in that, though, I think one of the interesting things, there's a variety of ways that we can take the outrage culture that it's been manifested. You can think about it in some of the research and some of the material that was put out relative to marijuana legalization, being outraged by the systems and circumstances they find themselves in. And to the extent that they're appealing to that research and to show the outrage that because of where they find themselves in order to be able to find escape in marijuana. You think about some of the outrage relative to the transgender movement that's happening right now. Only 1.4 million individuals, according to the Williams Institute, are transgender. 37% of Americans know someone who is transgender, but the outrage that they've been able to show about equality, the outrage that they've been able to show about access and accommodation makes you think that it's a majority of individuals that are transgender, right? If you just saw from the media perspective, you would think the vast majority of Americans are transgender, when in reality, 1.4 million in a country of 350 million individuals, and then 37% of Americans know someone for that matter. So just very fascinating world that we live in. So I'll end with this particular point, and then I'll take questions and then continue to sweat. And so I'm actually going to take the check off. I'm captivated by G.K. Chesterton for a variety of reasons. One, he's super funny. Two, I just think that he had such a I think funniness helps us to. I've always thought humor has a way of proclaiming truth in an indirect fashion. And Shakespeare has this quote that he says, I think it's in Sonnet 37, he says, jesters do often prove as prophets. So Chesterton has captivated my thinking and influenced me quite a bit, where I try to be funny, because more often than not, I'm delivering kind of hard truth. And so what I found with Chesterton, though, is he has this one line that I think is just so significant for the culture that we live in today. It's this: the true social fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves who's behind him. I think it's really easy to hate what's in front of us right now because of the destruction that it's causing individuals that we know and love and care for. An ideology that allows, an ideology and forces that are causing individuals to want to commit suicide. An ideology and ideology and forces that are saying, man, individuals are turning toward fentanyl and turning toward opioids in order to be able to escape from the pressures of this world and giving themselves over. An ideology that's distorting sexuality, making sexuality your primary mode of being. It's really easy to get angry in this culture today. It's really easy to become a victim in this culture today. But the reality of the matter is, for those that are in Christ, we are not victims, we are victors. We know how this story ends. According to 2 Corinthians 2:14 and 15, and by his grace we are always being led in victory, so that we might be the fragrant aroma of Christ among the living and the dead. We know how it ends. And because of that, we don't have to be angry, because our greatest weapon is our kindness and our love. Our kindness is the thing that leads to repentance. Our love is the differentiating and defining factor of us that allows us to stick out like styrofoam at a landfill. We have to be known for our love, being shown kind, and recognize that this world, we're increasingly a smaller segment of this world, increasingly very countercultural and different from this world. But the beautiful truth that we can cling to in this world is that we've always known that we're going to have trouble, but we can take heart because he has overcome the world. That we might not like the situation that we're in, but we can love the individual that's walking with us through it. He doesn't always take us out of these situations, but he always sees us through. Why? Because he's patient with us, and he's persistent with us in it as well. So as we navigate through and experience the challenges that come with a young generation that thinks very different than what you may do, a young generation that acts very differently than you would have acted, a young generation that thinks it's really good to run with the bulls, take heart and be patient. For your God exercise perfect patience on you, and he has called you to do likewise. Thanks so much.
You mentioned sort of a shift in apologetics.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And so Os Guinness' book, Fool's Talk,
Yeah.
I think is right on target.
Okay.
But the other, I'm involved with a Christian Study Center, so I'm looking for the ways to find points of contact, I guess. And another thing that I've read is that contrary to the research on giving, millennials are willing to engage in community service at sort of an unprecedented level. So what do you think about what I would call embodied apologetics through making common?
Yeah. I think there was an article I penned, I called it the Colin Kaepernick conundrum. So Colin, obviously we know him as the individual that has decided to take a pretty significant stand in culture by kneeling in football. But one of the things that I called it the Colin Kaepernick conundrum, because one of the primary ways that you can affect change in the U.S. is through the electoral system. And Colin proudly boasted that he wasn't going to vote. And what's fascinating is he was willing to give his time, he's willing to give his efforts to be able to protest. But when the time came to I would argue, to most illuminate, to most bring about the change, he decided not to. Which kind of led me down this other research tale to see, well, in reality too, and again, I know you can affect change from a variety of different ways, but I think from a political standpoint is one way to be able to enact that change, is to pair yourself up with the energy that you have with an institution to bring about that change that we talked about. And then, so looking at not only the voting patterns of millennials, because at that time Gen Z, I don't even think Gen Z still could vote. Gen Z couldn't vote at that time when I wrote it. But looking at the voting patterns, but even more than that, the level of apathy, according to a Harvard study, about individuals that aren't even registered to vote. So it's like 74%, if I remember, 76% of boomers are registered to vote. That number among millennials, that number is in the 50s. It's a significant decrease of just not even an apathy is what they termed it, which I thought was just so fascinating. Because again, I know that there are a variety of different ways to be able to exercise change in our culture, but if you're moving towards an injustice standpoint, it only makes sense to be able to leverage that in such a way that you might be able to enact change and put individuals into office that could see that change from a legislative standpoint. That's one of the things I was always captivated by Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, he was so shrewd and so wise with where he decided to protest. King just didn't show up anywhere. King always showed up where places where the organization was already set up into place and local stakeholders had a position at the table, because he recognized and knew it to be true that protesting highlights an issue, it doesn't solve it. And what he could do with the power of his presence, incarnation, what King was brilliant at is he would only show up and protest at places where he knew that he could shine the light, bring about the necessary upswelling of attention, in order that when he left, he had people at the table to bring about the changes that they needed. I thought that was brilliant. And so I don't know your position on Colin, and that's beside the point, I would argue, because what Colin has done, what I wish Colin would have done is I wish he could have paired that power that he had that caused everybody to have a conversation about it. Regardless of whether you watch football or not, everybody was having a conversation about whether you should kneel or not. But that power wasn't leveraged and channeled in such a way that could affect change through various ways. And then for him to get in front of everybody and say, I didn't even vote, and like express frustration, I just thought it was a missed opportunity. So, yes.
A few weeks ago, I was at Costco and there was a bumper sticker on a car in the parking lot, and it said, "Change the world, make dinner tonight." And so I coupled that with Rosaria Butterfield's hospitality, or excuse me, gospel comes with a house key.
Yes, yes.
Which I think is truly for our time. So what do you think about her thesis regarding inviting people to dinner? Over and over, she recounts that the neighbors who led her to Christ, she was a professor of English at Syracuse University in a lesbian relationship, and this pastor and his wife had her at their dinner table. She thinks maybe 400 meals.
Completely. I'm captivated by this. So the daily briefing forces me, it's this email that I send, it's like random stats that I always put in my head, and my brain's super weird, and then just kind of sometimes they stick. So like I'm captivated by it. So 2 years ago was the first time in the US, since we've been keeping research, that we had spent more money at restaurants than we spent at the grocery store. The average American eats out 4.5 times a day, 4.5 times a week rather. And so we're seeing this huge rise in the number of individuals that are going to eat out now. But the research is very clear when it comes to the power of the table. We know that from a biblical standpoint, right? We know the power of the table in the biblical narrative. Jesus always inviting people over for dinner. But we also know that from a research standpoint. Like having dinner with your kids not only increases their vocabulary, it decreases their chance of being sexually active before the age of 18. Not only it decreases their chance of getting in trouble at school, decreases chance of acting violently. There's so much reason. And then from a human standpoint, or from an adult standpoint, creates greater levels of compassion, greater levels of empathy, helps you to better understand your neighborhood issues, a greater local awareness. There is so much power in that, just that very simple inviting people over to dinner. To love, what Chesterton says, you've been called to love your neighbor and show hospitality. To love your enemy and show hospitality more often than not, because your enemy is your neighbor. And I completely agree, like the power of and that's what we've done. So like a little anecdote, as I live with 3 other guys, and so there's 4 of us that live in this house, and as you can imagine, when 4 post-grad guys decide that they're going to move into the neighborhood, it's not necessarily met with the most receptivity. Oh my goodness, there goes the neighborhood. But what we decided to do though, is we thought, okay, this is our chance. You're only gonna be the new neighbor once for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, so we gotta do something. Well, none of us has the ability to cook. None of us has the ability to bake, but all of us has the expendable income to go to a cookie store. And so what we decided is we went to a local cookie store called Tiff's Treats. It's a reminder of God's goodness and grace on this world. And then we went to Target to pick up these platters because, again, we're guys. We don't have Tupperware. We barely have plates. And our cups are usually just from like stadiums that we visit in. But here I am. I'm trying to be honest. It's not the trust tree. Don't judge me. I'll get triggered. So we just decided that we were going to go and give our 4 neighbors plates of cookies because we knew there was going to be a very small chance for us to show love. And we wanted to make sure that if they needed something, that we would be there for them, even though we have various schedules. And so we just have been very cognizant of wanting to know our neighbor, to know that right now Miss Pam and Mr. Bill are off right now visiting their kids, which ironically enough is in Tennessee. So that was a great commonality because we Tennesseans have to stick together down here. So all that to say, great power, great easy thing to do. And tonight's National Night Out, so you should be organizing new programs. Yes.
Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I read the past week, recently published a statistic that 32% of the millennials believe that President George W. Bush killed more people than Stalin. Does that statistic surprise you,
No.
and do you have any comment on it?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. Here in Dallas ISD last year, 19% of seniors graduated with being proficient in history.
19%?
19%.
Was that, okay, never mind.
And so I'm not, 52% out of a British study, 52% of individuals in England thought Hunger Games was in the Bible. I'm not, if you look at the research, 67% of Americans could not pass a citizenship test right
That
now.
I believe, yeah.
And so I'm not shocked by just a lack of awareness. I don't mean it bad. I don't mean it in a bad sense. Just an ignorance of things that so. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a comment and a question. You mentioned the outrage culture.
Mm-hmm.
Several years ago, my university paid for a speaker to come in and inform us that one of the things we should never say to anyone is, "Where are you from?" Because that's a microaggression. It means you don't belong here.
Yeah.
And I said, baloney. When you meet a new person, the first question is, what's your name? And the second question is, what you're from, because people are from all kinds of interesting places. This is an icebreaker. And she said, no, you can't say that because that's a microaggression.
Yeah.
And we paid for this person to come tell us to stop saying, where are you from?
There's a movement, and Karen Swallow Pryor, who's at Liberty, wrote a great piece in the Atlantic on this, to talk about the transition from political correctness to empathetic correctness that we're experiencing today. That sums it up. So political correctness is kind of given a bad rap, but I think we use political correctness as a boogeyman, when in reality political correctness was the natural outgrowth of us just trying to show manners to an increasingly diverse society. I think it can be taken too far, but I think political correctness is simply us just trying to show manners to individuals to bring more people in. Well, what happens is, it's often the case, you have extremes that take it to the next level. And so when political correctness is taken to the next level, then you have what Karen has called empathetic correctness. And empathetic correctness is, so political correctness is trying to make sure everybody feels included. Empathetic correctness is trying to make sure that those that are included are not harmed. So you've got your group now that's in, and now not only do you not want to harm them with your words, but you don't want to harm them internally as well. And so I would argue it's gone way too far. So the way that I do it is I always, because in Ubers is like the easiest way for me to start up some of these conversations. I always volunteer where I'm from to introduce the conversation, and then I transition, and because naturally I'm not from here, and then I can always transition and say, did you grow up here in the U.S.? Or did you grow up here, period?
Yeah, okay, my question is, I had a student who missed an exam, and I asked him why, and he said, because my mommy didn't call and wake me up this
Oh.
morning.
Yeah, it's,
Is that helicopter, or is that snowplow?
oh, it's snowplow.
Okay.
It's shocking, like, it's like 20%.
I was like, son, you're not ready for college.
Yeah, it's like 20%. It's absolutely shocking, the numbers of just the individuals that are on like snow, like that, and that's kind of like the trigger, the microaggression. Parents or whoever goes before you and makes sure that nothing is going to spring up or harm you on your path of life. There's an African proverb that says you don't prepare the road for the child, you prepare the child for the road. And what we found today is that you have more and more individuals that are deciding, I'm going to prepare the road instead of the child, and in turn, the child stays a child. And this is even true in biblical culture. We've moved away from the idea of children being an arrow and more with the children being a cannon. We just load them up and expect them just to stay there. When in reality, you got to do your best to direct and then shoot them off.
So did you fail your student or your parent?
Yeah.
I have some questions about campus activity. About 10 years ago, I started getting involved at SMU, and I just learned so much about, millennials and what they're doing. I'm just gonna mention a few things. One is that females are more into pornography than ever before, that they learn it from their boyfriends, and then they get hooked and they can't get out of it. That there's a big hookup, and we were talking this morning at the table about the big hookup culture, that girls have gotten just as brazen as guys about conquests and multiple conquests in one night. And then also, I also heard that there were a lot of people just dropping out and going homeless, that kind of thing. So can you just give us a little more information on the campus life and how we can deal with it?
Like there's a part of it, there is, so I'm always, I think that there's a hookup culture, but I also think, I'm also worried that pornography has eradicated the hookup culture. And so there was a great article in the Atlantic, why are the kids not having sex? Because pornography, from multiple ways, pornography is stunting their desires. And like you alluded to, I think it's 1/3 of girls below the age of 18 have watched pornography. So you have, but it's a much higher rate, obviously, for guys before the age of 12. And I mean, it doesn't help when 56% of pastors say that they've seen pornography within the past month. It's the silent killer that is stunting us and is doing something to us. Pastors. It's stunting us and doing something inside of us that we're not even sure of. And the interesting thing is, even the secular culture is catching on to it. You've got the office linebacker, I can't remember his real name, I just remember the office linebacker commercial that he's come out and say that, one, I've been addicted to pornography, two, this is a public health issue. I think it feeds into that hookup culture to a certain degree, because we see the significant numbers of girls that are experiencing Me Too on campus cultures. The numbers it's astronomical, the numbers of girls that are being sexually abused and sexually harassed and raped. But I think it's like 1 in 4 that this doesn't can tell. But what pornography is doing to us, I think it's causing I think it contributes to the loneliness piece of it. But what pornography is doing to young men and women in the college campus is just heinous. Like you even see it at Dallas Baptist University. So, and that, again, because this knows no bounds. And so we have been able to, we can detect it on IP addresses when they're connected on the website or on our Wi-Fi, but we can't detect it obviously when they're off it. It's spawned a whole host of issues. And so part of that is it does contribute to, if I saw it on TV, obviously I want to make its way in. I'm part of a human trafficking group. The research is very clear that there is a link between pornographic, watching pornography, and, which eventually leads into human trafficking and contributing to that as well. So I'm convinced it's doing something to us.
Yes, I heard there is a growing appreciation for Marxism and kind of socialism among millennials. Could you comment on these?
Yeah, so I'll go back to this point. And so it's funny because you're saying, you see the studies out of Harvard that indicate that 54% of college students favor socialism. When given the choice between socialism and capitalism, they say socialism. But then you dig down deeper into that research and you realize they don't really know what socialism is.
When you ask them, do you want to be like Cuba or Venezuela?
Yeah, so the good news is that, the bad news is obviously that there's a growing percent that want socialism. The good news is they don't know what socialism is, and so and then there's another part of it too. What is it? The natural. Well, I don't want to make that. I'll exercise self-restraint and show you the Holy Spirit is kind of short. But yeah, I don't give up. I think it's just I call it nut picking to a certain degree. So nut picking is just this idea of I'm going to choose an outlier example and then project that outlier example onto the entirety of a group. So for example, all Republicans are neo-Nazis, all Democrats want drag queen story hour, and all Christians are Westboro Baptist Church members. Yeah, I think that's false. I think that those are small outlier representatives that do not characterize the whole. And then if we make our way into the larger scene, I think there are very loud, small segments that are trying to say they speak for the entirety of a particular group, when in reality, they don't. So there was a hidden tribes study, which is a fascinating study, that indicated that from a political standpoint, there's 8% of progressive activists and 6% of the conservative, I can't remember what they called the conservatives, that were that activated, loud, extreme outlier that are feeding into this, when in reality, 67% of us are suffering from mild tinges of apathy because of how vitriolic it's become. Think about the 2016 election. I just finished an article on it. 1 in 6 Americans lost a friend because of the 2016 election. That 14% of Christians, church-going Christians, stopped attending their church because of the 2016 election. We are better than this. I think we're better.
Thanks, Peter. Oh, go ahead.
It's a small question, which is, what's the cutoff between the millennials and Gen Z?
Yeah, so according to Pew, it's 1980 to 1997. So it would be 98. But then, so Jean Twenge, in her book Gen Z, says that after Gen Z, it's I'm going to stop doing this generational research because it's just too segmented now. So, and there's a part of it too. I think not only is it too segmented, I also think the reality, just because the rapid changes that are happening within every year, that keeps us from this, and then also just the reality that we're being exposed to so much information now, that there's also a reality that we're just not having kids anymore. I mean, all our, right? Like every single professor in here has probably heard it from an administrator that's seen the precipitous drop in the number of college students that are available right now. And we all have friends that have either been a part of a university that's closed down or that's being merged right now. We're seeing this shrinking of the actual candidate pool of individuals. And that's probably more than you wanted to know. But it's just, thank you all.
Well, if they don't know what socialism is, they shouldn't be voting.
That's right.
Good news, they're not.